rejection that wrapped itself around me like a cold winter night. Looking back now, I realize that moment, the moment when my dreams were shattered in the most brutal way, was not the end, but the beginning. The spark that ignited a fire I never knew I carried inside me. But to truly understand the weight of that rejection, you need to know who I was back then. A boy born into hardship. A boy who learned early that dreams often cost more than I could afford. I grew up in a neighborhood where cracked pavements told stories of generations who struggled before me, where small houses leaned tiredly against one another, their paint peeling, their windows dusty, yet filled with people who carried hope in their tired eyes. My father worked long shifts in a factory, the kind of job that left his hands permanently rough, his back hunched before his time, while my mother stitched clothes late into the night to keep food on our table. Money was never enough, not even for the basics, but I carried within me a quiet belief that one day I would break free. One day I would carve a life where hunger wasn't a guest at our table and worry didn't shadow every conversation. Despite the struggles, I was a dreamer. I found solace in books borrowed from the community library, stories of men who had nothing but dared to chase everything, stories of kings who had once been peasants. Those pages filled me with visions of a future that seemed impossibly far away, yet close enough to touch if I reached with enough determination. But as much as I dreamed about changing my life, my heart was captivated by something, or rather, someone else. Her name was Claire. To me, she wasn't just another girl in school. She was the embodiment of every dream I had yet to achieve. Claire was the kind of girl who turned heads effortlessly, not only because of her beauty but because she carried herself with a grace that made her seem untouchable. Her laughter was like music, her words flowed like poetry, and her presence could brighten the dullest of days. I watched her from afar, never daring to step too close, because deep inside I knew our worlds didn't belong together. She lived in a house on the better side of town, the kind with well-kept lawns and shiny cars parked neatly in driveways, while I came home to cracked walls and bills that were always overdue. Still, my admiration for her only grew. I imagined conversations we might one day have, the way her smile might feel directed solely at me, the possibility that she could look past the worn-out clothes I wore and see the heart beating beneath. Every day I told myself I wasn't good enough, and every night I dreamed of proving myself wrong. The thought of her became my secret treasure, the thing I held on to when reality felt too heavy to bear. As the months passed, I began to convince myself that maybe, just maybe, she might not care about money or status. Maybe she could fall for someone who offered sincerity and loyalty instead of luxury. I rehearsed words in front of the mirror. I imagined scenarios where she would laugh at my jokes, and I pictured her hand in mine as though it was a possibility within reach. The more I thought about it, the braver I became. Until one day, I decided I could no longer keep my feelings hidden. I needed to tell her, even if my voice trembled, even if my heart broke in the process. I still remember that day, as if it happened yesterday. The sky was painted with hues of gold and pink, the kind of evening that whispers promises of hope, and my palms were sweaty as I walked toward her. She was standing by her locker, talking to her friends, her hair catching the last rays of sunlight like strands of fire. My chest tightened with every step, my stomach twisted with knots, but I told myself this was my chance, that fortune favored the bold, and that if I didn't speak now, I would regret it forever. When I finally stood in front of her, my voice almost betrayed me. I managed a smile, awkward and unsure, as I asked if I could speak with her privately. She looked at me curiously, maybe even with mild amusement, but she agreed. And for a brief moment, I felt like the universe had aligned in my favor. I gathered every ounce of courage I had stored over the years, and I told her what had lived in my heart for so long. I told her I admired her, that I had feelings for her, that I dreamed of a chance to show her how much she meant to me. My words stumbled, but they were genuine, raw, and filled with the kind of vulnerability I had never shown anyone before. Her reaction, however, was nothing like the fairy tales I had written in my mind. Claire stared at me, silent at first, and then she laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a soft chuckle, but a sharp, almost cruel laugh that made my heart sink instantly. Her eyes, once so captivating to me, now looked cold, judgmental, and filled with disbelief. "You? With me?" she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Don't be ridiculous, you're just poor. Do you really think a girl like me would ever consider a boy like you?" Her words cut deeper than any blade. Around us, a few students who had overheard began whispering, some even snickering, and I felt the ground beneath me collapse. My face burned, my throat tightened, and I wanted nothing more than to disappear, to vanish into the air and escape the humiliation that weighed heavier with each passing second. I had imagined rejection, yes, but not like this. Not the cruel mockery, not the way she stripped me of my dignity in front of others. I forced a weak smile, muttered something I can't even remember now, and walked away, each step heavier than the last. That night, lying in my small, dimly lit room, I replayed her words over and over, each repetition stabbing me deeper. "You're just poor." It wasn't only a rejection of my love, it was a rejection of my existence, a branding that I carried like an invisible scar. But what I didn't know then, as I lay broken and humiliated, was that her words would not be the end of me. They would become the very fuel that set me on a path I never imagined possible. A fire that would turn my pain into power, my shame into strength, and my weakness into an unstoppable drive. I didn't know then that her words would fuel the fire that would make me unstoppable. Her rejection didn't just break my heart, it broke my self-worth. In that moment when she laughed at me and dismissed my feelings like they were some kind of cheap joke, I felt something inside me splinter and fall apart in a way I had never known was possible. I had expected a no, maybe even a polite one, but I hadn't been prepared for the contempt in her voice, or the way her eyes narrowed at me as if I had overstepped some invisible boundary drawn by wealth and status. She didn't just say no. She said no while making sure everyone around us knew exactly why I wasn't worthy of her attention. It wasn't about me as a person. It was about me as a symbol of everything she thought was beneath her. And that truth stung more than the rejection itself ever could. I replayed her words over and over in my mind, like an old record with a scratch that won't let the song move on. "You're just poor. Just poor." Those two words echoed in my head all the way home that day, following me down cracked sidewalks and past flickering street lamps, whispering at me from the corners of my small room as I sat alone with my thoughts. I felt stripped of dignity, as if my worth as a human being had been weighed and measured and found lacking simply because of the numbers in my father's paycheck and the clothes on my back. It was more than heartbreak. It was humiliation, a very public one, the kind that burns itself into your memory so deeply you can still feel it years later. Nights became endless after that. I would lie awake staring at the ceiling of my tiny room, listening to the faint hum of the city outside, feeling the weight of her laughter pressing down on my chest. My mind wouldn't stop replaying the moment, every detail sharper than the last, the tilt of her head, the sneer of her friends, the silence that fell between my confession and her dismissal. Sleep became a stranger, and in its absence came questions that gnawed at me relentlessly. Was she right? Was I nothing but a poor boy reaching too high? Was there something inherently wrong with me that made me undeserving of respect or love? The more I asked, the deeper the doubt burrowed, until it felt like my very soul had been punctured by those words. During the day, it was no easier. Friends who had witnessed the scene offered pity wrapped in awkward jokes, the kind of comfort that makes the wound deeper rather than healing it. I could see it in their eyes, that mix of sympathy and judgment, as if they too had begun to see me through her lens. And the whispers at school or on the street only amplified what she had said out loud. "Did you hear what happened? He thought she'd say yes? Poor guys like him don't get girls like her." These words reached me like darts, thrown carelessly yet landing with precision, each one reaffirming that I was, in fact, the poor boy with no right to dream beyond my place. It wasn't just her rejection anymore. It was the world closing ranks to remind me where I belonged. My clothes felt heavier on my back, my shoes more worn, my hands rougher than they had before. Even people who had never spoken to me now felt entitled to treat me like a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when someone from our side of town dares to think they can cross the invisible barrier. I felt like a walking punchline, and no amount of keeping my head down could hide the scar of humiliation burning on my face. But in the quiet moments, somewhere beneath the weight of shame, another feeling began to stir, a flicker of anger. It started small, almost imperceptible, like the faintest ember in a dying fire. At first it was anger at her for treating me like I was nothing, then anger at myself for believing I was nothing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her words had only confirmed a belief I had already been carrying deep down, the belief that poverty defined me completely. That realization was as painful as it was liberating, because if a belief could be learned, it could also be unlearned, and I began to wonder if maybe I didn't have to accept the version of myself that everyone else had chosen for me. That anger grew into determination. Every time I heard her laughter echo in my memory, it stopped sounding like mockery and started sounding like a challenge. Every whisper, every pitying glance, every offhand comment about my place in the world became fuel for a fire that slowly started to build within me. It wasn't enough anymore to just dream of a better life in abstract terms. I needed to become someone so completely different from the boy she had humiliated that even she wouldn't recognize me if she saw me again. I didn't want revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to hurt her the way she had hurt me. I wanted something far more powerful. I wanted to rise so high above the version of me she had mocked that her rejection would one day feel like a footnote in a much larger story. But the path to that transformation wasn't clear yet. At first, I stumbled through days feeling like a ghost, going through the motions of school and home without direction, my mind caught between despair and determination. There were mornings when I wanted to stay in bed and disappear, and nights when the thought of giving up felt like a relief. Yet even in those moments, the ember of resolve refused to die out. It flickered faintly but persistently, whispering that I was meant for more, that this pain was not a wall but a doorway. I began to notice small signs of change in myself. Where before I would avoid confrontation, now I stood my ground, even in small ways. Where before I saw my poverty as a permanent identity, now I began to see it as a temporary circumstance. Where before I dreamed vaguely of success, now I started thinking in concrete terms about what success could mean for me, how I might get there, what steps I could take. It was a slow awakening, but it was real, and once I felt it, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The whispers and jokes didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder as people sensed something shifting in me. They called it arrogance, they called it delusion, but I knew better. I had looked humiliation in the eye, and it had burned away the part of me that cared about their approval. I wasn't trying to prove anything to them anymore. I was trying to prove something to myself, that I was not defined by my circumstances, that I was not condemned to stay where I had been born. Even my dreams about Claire changed. At first, they were filled with sadness, with longing for what might have been. But gradually, they became something else entirely. I began to picture a future where she would see me again, not as the poor boy she had mocked, but as a man she couldn't ignore. I didn't know how or when it would happen, but I clung to the image of that day as both a promise and a threat, a reason to keep moving even when everything in me wanted to stop. And so, while on the surface I still looked like the same boy, inside I had begun to harden into something different. I was no longer the boy who had confessed his love only to be laughed at. I was becoming someone new, someone who could take that pain and shape it into something unrecognizable, someone who could look back one day and thank her for the rejection that had once destroyed him. That night, staring at the ceiling again, but this time with a strange calm in my chest, I realized something profound. I could let her rejection define me forever, or I could let it forge me into something stronger. I could collapse under the weight of her words, or I could rise above them and build a life where no one would ever dare say such things to me again. I swore to myself then and there, with a clarity that felt like steel sliding into my veins, that I would never be powerless again. Sometimes pain pushes you toward places you never dreamed of. I had spent weeks drowning in the aftermath of her rejection, allowing the weight of her words to crush me every night as I lay awake, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, unable to silence the echo of her laughter. It was as if my soul had been shackled by those two words. Just poor. And no matter how hard I tried, I could not escape the suffocating grip of shame. But there comes a moment in every broken person's life when the pain of staying the same finally outweighs the fear of change. And for me, that moment came unexpectedly, like a spark striking in total darkness. It was an ordinary afternoon, or at least it began that way. I was sitting in the small corner of the public library where I often sought refuge, surrounded by the scent of old books and the soft rustling of pages turned by strangers who seemed to live in worlds far removed from mine. My mind was restless, unable to focus, heavy with thoughts of failure and inadequacy. I remember pulling a book at random, more to distract myself than with any real intention of reading. And as fate would have it, that book became the catalyst for everything that followed. It was a worn copy of a biography, the story of a man who had risen from nothing, literally nothing, to build a life so vast and powerful that people who once ignored him now spoke his name with awe. As I turned those pages, something inside me stirred. His struggles mirrored mine, his doubts sounded eerily familiar. But what set him apart wasn't luck or privilege. It was his refusal to accept that his circumstances defined his destiny. He failed, and then he failed again. Yet each failure carved out a lesson that made him stronger until, eventually, he built a life greater than anything he had imagined. That story lit a fire in me. For the first time, I realized that pain did not have to end in defeat. It could become the raw material for transformation, if only I had the courage to use it. That night, I walked home with the book pressed against my chest, as though it carried a secret meant only for me. For the first time since that humiliating day, I felt a shift within myself, a whisper that said I didn't have to remain the poor boy mocked and dismissed. I had a choice. I could allow rejection to be the cage that kept me trapped forever, or I could make it the hammer that broke the chains I had been born into. With trembling hands and a heart that still carried scars, I made my decision. I would change my life. The first steps were small, almost invisible to anyone watching from the outside. But to me, they felt monumental. I began to wake earlier, forcing myself out of bed before the sun, determined to use every extra hour I could steal. I started reading not just stories, but guides on self-improvement, business, and discipline. My notebooks filled with scribbles of ideas, goals, and plans that seemed impossible, yet gave me a strange kind of hope. I took small jobs, anything I could find, not just to earn money, but to teach myself the value of persistence. Each coin saved, each skill learned, became a brick in the foundation of the person I was trying to become. But change is never smooth. For every small success, there were failures waiting like predators in the shadows. I tried launching a small side business selling refurbished electronics, only to watch it collapse within months because I hadn't managed money properly. I invested what little I had into a training course, only to realize halfway through that it wasn't going to lead me where I wanted to go. There were nights when I came home empty-handed, exhausted, with nothing but disappointment gnawing at me. Each failure whispered that she had been right, that I was foolish to believe I could climb out of the hole I had been born into. There were moments I nearly gave up, moments when the pain of constant setbacks made me wonder if I was only setting myself up for more humiliation. I would stare at the mirror, searching for some hint of the man I was trying to become, and all I saw was the same tired boy, wearing the same worn-out clothes, trapped in the same cycle of inadequacy. I questioned my worth, questioned whether transformation was even possible for someone like me. And yet, even at my lowest, I could not silence the memory of her words. "You're just poor." Those words haunted me, but they also pushed me, because every time I thought of surrendering, I imagined a future where her voice no longer had power over me. Resilience was not something I was born with. It was something I learned, carved painfully out of failure and persistence. Slowly, I began to see failure not as the end, but as a teacher. Every mistake revealed a weakness, and every weakness showed me where I needed to grow stronger. When my first business attempt crumbled, I learned the importance of planning and patience. When people dismissed my ideas, I learned that belief in myself had to be stronger than their doubts. When I felt like quitting, I discovered that persistence itself was a skill, one that grew sharper the more I practiced it. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't quick. There were no sudden miracles or easy shortcuts. But there was progress. Slow, steady, undeniable progress. My body grew leaner and stronger as I disciplined myself physically. My mind sharpened as I devoured books and courses. My confidence, though fragile, began to take root, nurtured by the knowledge that I was no longer the same boy who had walked home broken that day. I was becoming something else, something more. The more I grew, the more I realized that success was not about proving her wrong. It was about proving myself right. I didn't need her validation anymore. I needed my own. And that realization carried with it a power so profound that it began to alter the way I saw everything. Opportunities that once seemed invisible began to reveal themselves, as though the universe had been waiting for me to change my perspective before it handed me the keys. And then, just as I was beginning to find my footing, it happened. An opportunity so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that it felt almost like destiny knocking on my door. I didn't know it yet, but this single chance would become the turning point of my entire life, the one decision that would set me on the road to a future I had once believed was impossible. Then came the opportunity that would change everything. Success isn't loud. It's built in the shadows where no one notices you. At least, that's what I came to learn during the years that followed my decision to change. The world celebrates the outcome, but never pays attention to the unseen hours, the sacrifices, the nights spent staring into the dark with nothing but determination to keep you company. My journey didn't begin with applause or recognition. It began with silence. The kind of silence that feels suffocating at first, but eventually becomes the background music of persistence. I crafted a routine that would have seemed unbearable to most people my age. While others my age woke up late, scrolling through their phones or planning outings with friends, I dragged myself out of bed before dawn. The alarm clock became both my enemy and my ally, its shrill ring cutting through the comfort of sleep and reminding me that comfort was not what I was chasing anymore. I spent my mornings reading, studying, and teaching myself everything I could about business, finance, and self-discipline. Books became my mentors, words became my guides, and my notebook became the blueprint of a life I was determined to build. Days were consumed with work. Any work I could find. I took odd jobs that paid little, but taught me lessons no classroom ever could. I washed dishes in restaurants where the steam from the kitchen clung to my skin, leaving me exhausted but quietly proud that I had earned something with my own hands. I carried boxes in warehouses until my arms ached, my back stiff, but my spirit somehow fueled by the knowledge that I was investing in myself. When opportunities for side hustles appeared, reselling items online, fixing old electronics, tutoring younger students, I took them all, no matter how small they seemed. Every dollar saved was not just money. It was proof that I was moving forward, even if the progress was invisible to everyone else. Sacrifice became the language of my life. While friends spent weekends going to parties, I stayed in, poring over books, analyzing business ideas, or working extra shifts. I missed out on laughter, on late-night conversations, on the carefree adventures of youth, because I understood something they didn't. I was not building a moment, I was building a future. And yet, no matter how hard I worked, people rarely understood. They mistook my absence for arrogance, my focus for antisocial behavior. I heard the whispers, the judgments, the laughter from those who thought I was wasting my best years. But I carried their words the same way I carried hers, using them as fuel rather than letting them drag me down. Loneliness was the hardest part. Success in its early stages is a solitary journey, and I felt it in every quiet evening when I sat alone in my room while the world outside carried on without me. There were days when I longed for companionship, for someone to share my burden, but I quickly realized that few people understood the hunger that burned inside me. Most people wanted comfort, not growth, and comfort was a luxury I could no longer afford. So I learned to be my own companion, to draw strength from solitude, to let the silence sharpen me instead of breaking me. And always, beneath the exhaustion, beneath the sacrifice, beneath the long hours and endless effort, there was the echo of her voice, the memory of her laughter, the sting of her rejection. It never truly left me. But over time, its meaning shifted. At first it haunted me, a wound that refused to heal. Then it became a motivator, a constant reminder of what I never wanted to feel again. Eventually, it transformed into something even more powerful. A vow. Every time I felt too tired to go on, I reminded myself that I was not only proving her wrong, I was proving myself right. Every sleepless night, every dollar saved, every failure endured. It was all part of building a version of myself that would never again be at the mercy of someone else's judgment. The grind was brutal, but it was not without rewards. I remember the first time I saved enough money to buy something I wanted without having to calculate how much food or rent it would cost me in exchange. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a new pair of shoes. But to me, it felt like a crown, a symbol that I was no longer completely trapped by poverty. That purchase gave me a glimpse of freedom, a reminder that hard work could indeed change circumstances, however slowly. Then came the moment when one of my first small ventures actually turned a profit. I had started reselling refurbished electronics online, a skill I picked up from trial and error, and after weeks of struggling, one sale led to another. For the first time, I saw money coming in that wasn't tied to hours of labor, but to an idea I had acted upon. The numbers were small, laughable to anyone on the outside, but to me, they were monumental. They were proof that the world was beginning to reward the seeds I had been planting in silence. Each of these small wins, insignificant as they might have seemed to others, became my lifeline. They reminded me that progress wasn't always visible day by day, but over time, it built into something undeniable. My body was exhausted, my mind often doubted, but my spirit grew stronger with each step forward. I had learned to embrace the grind not as punishment, but as preparation. A furnace that was shaping me into something unrecognizable from the boy who had once walked home in shame after being laughed at. The irony was that the louder the world celebrated temporary pleasures, the quieter my life became. But in that quiet, I found a strength they could not imagine. I realized that greatness is often born in obscurity, away from applause, away from validation, away from the eyes of those who will only show up once the success is visible. I was building a foundation, brick by brick, sweat by sweat, sacrifice by sacrifice. And I knew deep down that one day, when the walls of my life stood tall and unshakable, the same people who doubted me would wonder how it happened overnight, never knowing it was years in the making. But even as I embraced the grind, even as I found strength in the silence, I could not have predicted what lay ahead. I thought I understood hard work, sacrifice, and persistence, but the universe had plans for me that went far beyond anything I had imagined. Because just when I thought I was slowly carving a path toward stability, something unexpected appeared on the horizon. Something bigger, bolder, and more life-changing than any of the small victories I had celebrated so far. But I wasn't ready for how big my next break would be. From a nobody, I started becoming someone people couldn't ignore. At first it was subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind of change that creeps into your life so slowly you don't realize it's happening until you look back and see how far you've come. The silent grind, the sleepless nights, the endless sacrifices. They had carved me into someone sharper, tougher, more disciplined, and when the opportunity arrived, I was ready to seize it with both hands. My breakthrough came in the form of a business idea that most people dismissed as too risky, too uncertain, the kind of thing a poor boy with no connections had no business attempting. But I had learned something crucial in those years of grinding. Opportunities rarely come dressed in certainty. They come wrapped in risk. And the difference between those who remain stuck and those who rise is not fearlessness, but the willingness to act despite fear. I poured every ounce of savings I had, every lesson I had learned from my early failures, into that one idea. The nights grew longer, the work more demanding, and for months it felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, praying the ground wouldn't collapse beneath me. And then, finally, the tide turned. My idea caught traction, slowly at first, and then with a momentum that felt almost unstoppable. The same people who had once laughed at me now watched with curiosity, then with surprise, and finally with admiration as my business began to generate real results. Money started coming in, not in trickles like before, but in waves that gave me room to breathe, to expand, to think beyond survival. For the first time in my life, I wasn't calculating whether I could afford the basics. I was calculating how to grow, how to invest, how to build something bigger than myself. With money came recognition, and with recognition came respect. The boy who had once been invisible, mocked for daring to reach beyond his station, was now being invited into rooms where decisions were made. People who had overlooked me before began to call me Sir, their tones laced with the kind of deference I had only ever seen given to others. My voice, once ignored, now carried weight. My presence, once dismissed, now commanded attention. And though part of me reveled in this transformation, another part of me remained cautious, remembering the sting of humiliation, reminding myself never to forget where I had come from. The contrast between my past life and my present was startling. I moved from cramped, dimly lit rooms into spaces filled with light, high ceilings, and windows that overlooked the kind of cityscapes I had once only admired from afar. The clothes I wore no longer marked me as poor. They fit me with a confidence that seemed to signal to the world that I belonged wherever I chose to stand. The shoes on my feet were no longer worn thin. They carried me with pride into meetings, events, and opportunities I had once believed were out of reach. Even the food I ate tasted different, not because it was prepared with more skill, but because it no longer carried the bitter aftertaste of worry. Yet, no matter how high I climbed, I never let myself forget the boy who had walked home, broken after being told he wasn't good enough. His pain lived inside me like a shadow, a constant reminder of why I pushed so hard, why I refused to slow down even when exhaustion begged me to stop. Every achievement, every milestone, was not just a victory for the man I had become. It was a promise kept to the boy I once was, the boy who had sworn he would never be powerless again. My lifestyle transformed in ways I could never have imagined during those years of struggle. I traveled to places I had only seen in magazines, stood in buildings where deals were made that shaped industries, and shook hands with people whose names carried weight in boardrooms across the city. I drove cars that once seemed like distant dreams, sat in restaurants where the prices on the menu would have once terrified me, and slept in homes that felt like palaces compared to the cramped space I had grown up in. And yet, through it all, I carried the memory of rejection with me, not as a burden but as a torch that lit my path forward. People began to look at me differently. Strangers admired me, friends respected me, and even those who had doubted me now spoke of me with awe, as if they had always known I was destined for more. But I never forgot that these same people had once whispered behind my back, had once labeled me as nothing more than the poor boy who reached too high. I learned to accept their respect, but never to depend on it, because respect earned from success is fickle. It is loyalty to power, not to the person. True strength, I realized, came not from their admiration, but from the unshakable belief I had built within myself. It wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about transformation. I had grown into someone unrecognizable, not just to the world, but even to myself. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the timid boy who had been laughed at for daring to confess his feelings. I saw a man who had clawed his way out of obscurity, who had turned pain into power, who had taken every wound and forged it into armor. And that realization filled me with a sense of pride deeper than any applause could ever give. Yet, as much as my new life filled me with satisfaction, it also carried a strange emptiness. Success, I discovered, is intoxicating, but also isolating. The higher I rose, the fewer people I found who could truly understand the journey I had taken. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the loneliness, it all remained invisible to those who only saw the polished version of my life. And in that isolation, I found myself thinking, time and again, about the one person whose rejection had started it all. I didn't know where she was or what she was doing, but in quiet moments, her voice still echoed, not with pain anymore, but with curiosity. What would she think if she saw me now? For years, that thought remained nothing more than a distant question, an echo I carried with me as I built and grew and climbed. I imagined scenarios, played them out in my head, but never truly believed they would come to pass. Life, however, has a strange way of circling back, of weaving stories together in ways that shock you when you least expect it. Because after years of silence, after years of rising from nothing to something, after years of proving to myself and the world that I was no longer the poor boy she had laughed at, fate intervened. One ordinary day, in a setting I could never have predicted, our paths finally crossed again. And then, after years, our paths crossed again. Fate has a strange way of bringing the past back into your life. It doesn't arrive politely, knocking on your door when you feel prepared. It crashes in uninvited, dragging with it memories you thought you had buried and emotions you believed you had conquered. For years, I had lived with the echo of her voice haunting me, the sting of her laughter fueling my grind. But in time it had become a shadow, something that lingered behind me rather than standing directly in front of me. I thought I had moved beyond her, that the man I had become was too far removed from the boy she had mocked. But fate, in its ruthless humor, chose to prove me wrong on a day I never expected. It was an afternoon like any other, one of those long days filled with back-to-back meetings, decisions that carried weight, and the constant buzz of phones and emails demanding my attention. I had built a business that now stood tall, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but steady and respected. My schedule was overflowing, my life wrapped in the momentum of success, and I had grown used to commanding rooms filled with people who once wouldn't have even remembered my name. I walked into yet another conference room that day, expecting nothing more than another round of negotiations, another deal to close, another step forward in the empire I was carefully shaping. But when I opened that door, my past came rushing back with such force that it nearly stole the breath from my chest. She was there, Claire. For a moment the world seemed to slow, and all the noise around me faded into silence. There she was, sitting across the table, dressed in professional attire, her hair neatly tied, her posture composed, but her presence was unmistakable. It had been years, yet I recognized her instantly, the same way you recognize a scar even after the wound has healed. My heart jolted, not with longing, not even with pain, but with the sheer shock of seeing the girl who had once humiliated me now sitting in a room where I held the power. I studied her carefully, the way her eyes darted around the room, the slight tension in her posture. And then, as her gaze finally landed on me, I saw it, recognition. It flickered across her face in an instant, surprise widening her eyes, confusion knitting her brows, and then something else, something harder to define. Was it disbelief? Was it regret? Or was it the dawning realization that the poor boy she had once dismissed was no longer poor, no longer the boy she remembered at all? I cannot deny that moment gave me a rush of emotions I could hardly process. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a strange heaviness, as if the years of struggle condensed into that single second, demanding acknowledgement. She looked at me, and I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile the image she had once known with the man standing confidently at the head of the table. I was not the timid boy stammering a confession of love anymore. I was a leader, a businessman, a man who commanded respect. The shift in power was palpable, and though she said nothing at first, her silence screamed louder than any words could. I took my seat at the head of the table, my movements calm, deliberate, exuding the composure I had worked so hard to master. Around us the meeting began, introductions were exchanged, but I saw the way her eyes lingered on me, the way she struggled to focus, the way her professionalism faltered ever so slightly in the presence of someone she had never expected to see again. Certainly not like this. I answered questions, led the discussion, and every time I spoke, I could feel the shift in her, the quiet realization that she was no longer in control of the narrative. Her reaction fascinated me. She tried to mask it, tried to hold on to her composure, but her eyes betrayed her. They widened when I spoke with authority, narrowed when others deferred to me, and softened with something I couldn't quite name when our gazes locked. Did she remember her cruel laughter that day? Did she remember the words she had thrown at me like knives? Or was she too busy trying to make sense of the man I had become? I thought back to the day she had rejected me. How powerless I had felt, how small. And now, sitting across from her, I realized how far I had come, how completely the tables had turned. I wasn't the poor boy anymore. I was the man in charge, the one everyone in the room looked to for direction. The power dynamic that had once crushed me was now reversed, and though I carried myself with calm restraint, inside I couldn't help but feel the sharp irony of it all. As the meeting continued, I noticed her growing unease. She avoided speaking directly to me unless absolutely necessary, and when she did, her voice carried a slight tremor, betraying the confidence she was trying so desperately to maintain. I remained composed, professional, but beneath that calm exterior, A storm of emotions raged. Satisfaction mingled with curiosity, pride mixed with restraint, and beneath it all was the undeniable truth that fate had placed her back into my life for a reason. I wondered what was going through her mind. Did she regret that moment years ago? Did she realize the depth of the wound she had caused and the fire it had ignited? Did she see in front of her not just the man I had become, but also the boy she had once crushed under the weight of her arrogance? Whatever the case, she could not escape the reality of who I was now, and I could not escape the undeniable fact that life had given me the chance to face her again, not as the broken boy she had laughed at, but as the man who had risen above it all. The meeting ended, and as the room emptied, she lingered, as though torn between leaving quietly and saying something. Our eyes met once more, and in that silence, countless unspoken words passed between us. I could see the question in her eyes, the disbelief, the searching for something familiar in a face that had grown harder, stronger, more resolute. I said nothing, simply offered a polite nod before gathering my papers, and in that moment, I knew the balance of power had shifted permanently. But what she didn't know, what no one in that room yet realized, was that this was only the beginning. She hadn't just stumbled into a meeting with a man from her past. She had stepped unknowingly into a story where I was no longer the rejected boy, no longer the one left powerless. Because the truth, the shocking reality she was about to face, was far greater than she could imagine. What she didn't know was that I was about to be her new boss. The same lips that once said, "You're not good enough," now trembled in shock. I could see it in her face the moment the truth settled over her like an unwelcome shadow. Claire realized that I wasn't just another face in the meeting room, that I wasn't simply an old ghost from her past suddenly reappearing by coincidence. No, I was the one sitting at the head of the table, the one whose words carried weight, the one whose signature decided the fate of the very company she worked for. The disbelief in her eyes was almost poetic, as though the universe had orchestrated this reunion with deliberate precision, not simply to bring us back together, but to remind her of the choice she had once made and the consequences that followed. Her reaction fascinated me. At first, there was confusion. Her brows furrowed. Her lips parted as though she wanted to say something but couldn't form the words. Then came recognition, the undeniable spark of memory flashing in her eyes as she realized exactly who I was. And finally, the shock, so raw and unguarded that she quickly tried to hide it behind a mask of professionalism. But no matter how hard she tried to compose herself, her discomfort slipped through the cracks. An awkward pause here, a hesitant tone there, the subtle avoidance of my gaze when our eyes met. It was all there, plain as day, and though I remained calm and composed, inside I felt the weight of justice being silently delivered. I noticed how her colleagues addressed me with respect, some even with admiration, their voices laced with the kind of reverence that only power can command. She heard it, too, every "sir," every deferential nod, every moment when the room turned to me for direction. She must have compared it to the memory of the boy who had once confessed his feelings, trembling, uncertain, his pockets empty, and his heart exposed. The contrast between then and now could not have been starker, and I could see in her shifting posture that she felt it deeply. As the days turned into weeks, our professional interactions became more frequent, and with each one, the imbalance of power grew clearer. I didn't flaunt my authority, nor did I remind her of the past with words, but my presence alone was enough to make her uncomfortable. She stumbled slightly in presentations when I entered the room, her voice catching as though my very existence rattled her confidence. She lingered longer on documents, double-checking her work as though terrified of making a mistake in front of me. And every time she looked at me, I saw something flickering in her expression, a mixture of regret, unease, and perhaps even longing. Regret, that was the most obvious. It lingered in the way she avoided conversations about personal life, as though she feared revealing too much. It lingered in the way she sometimes glanced at me when she thought I wasn't watching, her eyes carrying the weight of questions she could never ask aloud. Did she regret her words? Did she regret rejecting me with such cruelty? Or did she regret not seeing the potential in the boy who had grown into the man before her? I never asked, and she never told. But the silence between us was louder than any confession could have been. The tension between us was not limited to private moments. It seeped into the workplace dynamics as well. Every room we shared became a silent battlefield, a constant reminder of how drastically the tables had turned. Where once she had dismissed me, now she could not escape me. My authority was woven into every project, every directive, every decision that shaped her professional life. She had no choice but to acknowledge me, to follow my lead, to operate under the shadow of the man she once mocked. I remained professional, composed, and deliberately distant. I never allowed myself to slip into pettiness, never used my position to humiliate her because I didn't need to. The quiet truth of my success and her discomfort spoke volumes louder than any revenge I could have enacted. And yet my restraint only seemed to amplify her unease. She must have wondered whether I remembered that night, whether I still carried the sting of her rejection, whether I had waited all these years for this very moment. She must have asked herself every day if I would one day confront her, if I would use my authority to remind her of the words that had once cut me so deeply. But the truth was far more complicated. I did remember. How could I not? That night was carved into me, a wound that had shaped everything I had become. And though I no longer carried the same pain, the memory was a part of me, woven into the very fabric of my success. She had been the catalyst, the spark that ignited the fire, and seeing her now, caught in the gravity of my power, stirred emotions I had spent years suppressing. It wasn't just satisfaction. It was a strange, bittersweet recognition that life had brought us full circle. Still, I wasn't blind to her humanity. Beneath the layers of regret and discomfort, I saw glimpses of vulnerability, moments when her smile faltered, when her shoulders slumped under the weight of memories she could not erase. She was no longer the carefree girl who had once looked down on me with laughter. She was a woman carrying her own burdens, her own mistakes, and perhaps even her own regrets. Part of me wondered what her life had been like since that night, whether she had found happiness or whether she had been haunted, as I had been, by the words she had spoken. But another part of me, the part hardened by years of struggle, refused to soften, refused to let her off so easily. Every interaction with her felt like a chess game. She would smile politely, but I could see the tension in her jaw. She would speak confidently, but her voice always wavered slightly when directed at me. She would act professional, but her eyes betrayed her inner turmoil. And I, sitting across from her, calm and controlled, made no effort to ease her discomfort. I let her feel it. Let her sit in the silence of her own making. Let her grapple with the reality that the man she had dismissed now held the power she once wielded so carelessly. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The same girl who had once believed I wasn't good enough was now bound to my authority, her career tethered to the decisions I made. And though I carried myself with restraint, I knew deep down that I wasn't ready to forgive, not ready to forget, not ready to let her walk away from the weight of her choices. Because while she was beginning to realize the power had shifted, what she didn't know yet was that I wasn't going to make it easy for her. True power isn't about shouting. It's about the calm control you hold. I had learned that lesson the hard way, through years of being overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. When you grow up poor, when people laugh at you for daring to dream, when the person you once cared for most mocks you in front of others, you discover that noise has no value. Power is not found in loud declarations or desperate attempts to prove yourself. Real power is quiet, unshakable, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it is already known, already felt, already undeniable. And now, sitting in boardrooms, walking through offices where every step echoed authority, I carried that power in silence. With Claire working under my leadership, the dynamics between us became more and more revealing. I made no effort to call attention to our past, no effort to confront her with her old words, but my very presence did the work for me. Every time I entered a room, I felt the shift in the air. People stood straighter, their eyes turned toward me, their voices softened with respect. Colleagues sought my approval, executives deferred to my judgment, and decisions often rested on my final word. I didn't need to demand recognition. It was given freely, the natural result of years of relentless effort. And though I remained professional, composed, and detached, I could see how deeply it affected her. Claire's eyes followed me constantly, not in the way they once had when she dismissed me as nothing, but with something heavier: confusion, regret, longing, maybe even admiration. She watched how others treated me, how doors opened when I walked by, how conversations quieted until I spoke, and I could see her trying to reconcile that reality with the memory of the boy she had once laughed at. There were moments when I caught her staring, her expression distant, as though she was replaying that night in her mind, trying to piece together how the boy she had rejected had become the man commanding such respect. Her struggle was visible, though she tried to hide it. She was good at maintaining her composure, at presenting herself as confident and capable, but her body betrayed her in subtle ways. The way her shoulders stiffened when I entered a room, the slight tremor in her voice when she addressed me directly, the fleeting look of vulnerability in her eyes when she thought no one was watching. It was as though she lived in two worlds, the one where she was a competent professional, and the one where she could not escape the memory of what she had once thrown away. And I, on my part, said nothing. I never raised my voice, never reminded her of her cruelty, never wielded my power like a weapon against her. Instead, I maintained a calm, dignified presence, treating her no differently than I treated anyone else, giving her no reason to accuse me of holding a grudge. Yet that very silence was louder than anything I could have said. It forced her to live with her own thoughts, to carry the weight of her past words in every interaction. She never knew if I remembered, never knew what I truly felt, never knew if the silence was forgiveness or punishment. And in that uncertainty, she suffered. There is a certain strength in restraint, in knowing that you could destroy someone with words or actions but choosing not to. I had reached a place where I no longer needed revenge. Her discomfort, her regret, her realization of what she had lost, that was more powerful than any confrontation. And perhaps, in some ways, it was kinder too. By remaining silent, I gave her the space to confront herself, to see the gap between the man I had become and the boy she had dismissed. Every day that gap grew wider. Every day it became harder for her to ignore. And every day she seemed to crumble a little more under the weight of her own recognition. But my silence did not mean indifference. I noticed everything. I noticed the way she lingered after meetings, as though she wanted to say something but lacked the courage. I noticed the way she hesitated when others praised me, her eyes betraying emotions she refused to speak. I noticed the way she seemed to shrink slightly when I gave directives, not because I treated her harshly, but because she remembered a time when she had treated me as if I was beneath her. Now she was forced to answer to me, and the irony was sharp enough to cut. And in the quiet moments when the offices were empty, and I found myself alone with my thoughts, I wondered what she truly felt. Was it only regret for the cruelty of her rejection? Or was it regret for losing the chance to be part of the life I had built? Did she envy the respect I commanded, the stability I had created, the confidence I carried? Or was it something more personal? Did she remember the boy who had once cared for her so deeply? And did she wonder what it might have been like if she had said yes instead of laughing? I never asked, and she never told, but the tension between us was undeniable. It grew with every passing day, woven into the fabric of our professional interactions, silent but powerful. Others in the office may not have noticed, but I felt it every time our eyes met, every time she stumbled over her words, every time the silence between us grew heavy with unspoken memories. Her regret began to surface more openly. I saw it in the way she tried to overcompensate, working harder, speaking softer, showing a kind of deference she hadn't shown to anyone else. It was as though she was trying to earn back something she knew she had lost long ago, though she never dared to name it. And the more she tried, the more obvious it became to me that the tables had not only turned, but had shattered entirely. She was no longer the one holding the power in our story. I was. Still, beneath all of it, I carried a question. I had built my life on the fuel of her rejection, had transformed myself into someone unrecognizable because of the pain she had caused. And yet now, faced with her silent regret, I wondered what my next step should be. Should I continue to let silence be my answer? To let her wrestle with her own conscience? Or should I confront her, remind her directly of the words she had once used, force her to face them not as a boy broken, but as a man who had risen beyond her imagination? The power I held was undeniable, the silence I carried was deafening, and the question burned within me. But was I ready to remind her of the past? Regret is the heaviest chain a heart can carry. It doesn't appear all at once. It creeps in slowly, settling first in the corners of your mind before spreading into every thought, every glance, every breath you take. And with Claire, I could see that chain tightening around her, link by link, as the weeks went by. She tried to carry herself with composure, to maintain the air of confidence and professionalism that had once made her untouchable. But behind her eyes, regret lived like a ghost, haunting her in ways she could no longer disguise. At first, it was subtle, so subtle that others might not have noticed. She lingered in meetings after everyone else had left, as though hoping I might say something to her, something that would open a door back into the past. She found excuses to ask me questions she could have easily answered herself, her voice soft, her tone almost careful, as though she was testing the ground before taking a step. I noticed the hesitation in her eyes, the way she seemed to want to explain herself, to rewrite the story that had unfolded between us years ago. But each time the words stayed trapped in her throat. As time passed, her regret began to take shape in more visible ways. She began to compliment me in passing, remarks disguised as casual but carrying the weight of something more. She noticed the way I dressed, the calmness with which I handled pressure, the respect I commanded from others, and I could see in her eyes that she was no longer looking at me as the poor boy she had once mocked, but as the man she now admired, perhaps even desired. And yet beneath that admiration was the bitter taste of what she had lost, the life she might have shared, the future she might have stepped into, had she not turned me away with cruel laughter all those years ago. There were moments when I caught her staring at me, not with the dismissive eyes of the past, but with longing, as though she was replaying every decision she had ever made and wondering what could have been different. She would quickly look away when I noticed, but the vulnerability in her gaze lingered long after. It was such a stark contrast to the girl I remembered, the girl who had once radiated arrogance, who had looked at me with disdain, who had believed herself untouchable. Now, sitting across from me in meeting rooms, she seemed fragile, her confidence cracked by the weight of her own choices. The irony was sharp. She had rejected me because I was poor, because I didn't fit into the picture of the life she thought she deserved. Yet now, as she watched me walk into rooms that once would have been closed to both of us, as she witnessed the respect and admiration that surrounded me, she realized the depth of her mistake. I could see it in every nervous smile, every faltering word, every subtle attempt to bridge the gap between us. She had chosen arrogance over sincerity, pride over love, and now she was paying the price with regret that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. I remember one particular afternoon when she approached me in the office hallway. She stopped me under the pretense of asking about a project, but her voice wavered, her eyes searching mine for something more than just a professional answer. "You've really built something incredible," she said softly, almost as if the admission itself cost her something. I nodded politely, my response measured, my tone calm, offering her no comfort, no opening for the conversation she seemed to be yearning for. She smiled faintly, but it was not the confident smile I once remembered. It was a smile cracked with vulnerability, with longing, with the weight of a heart learning too late what it had lost. Her attempts grew more frequent. She found reasons to stay behind after group discussions, small excuses to ask me questions that didn't truly matter, her eyes always betraying the real intention: to connect, to explain, to find some way to lessen the burden of regret she carried. But I remained distant, dignified, professional. I never gave her the satisfaction of knowing what I was thinking, never revealed whether I remembered the night she had crushed me, never let her see past the calm exterior I had built. And in that silence, I could see her unraveling, torn between wanting to confess and fearing what my response might be. Her vulnerability contrasted so starkly with the arrogance I once knew that it almost startled me. The girl who had once been so sure of herself now seemed uncertain, hesitant, her confidence fractured by the weight of her past mistake. The power she had once held over me was gone, replaced by a fragile vulnerability that seemed to consume her from the inside out. I could see it in the way she lowered her gaze when I entered the room, the way she stumbled over words she once would have spoken effortlessly, the way she lingered near me as though proximity alone might offer her redemption. And yet, despite all of this, I remained silent. I did not confront her, did not offer forgiveness, did not reveal the storm of emotions I felt beneath the surface. My silence forced her to face herself, to carry the weight of her regret without relief, without escape. She wanted to explain, wanted to rewrite history, but I refused to give her that chance. Not yet. She had to live with the reality she had created, to see the consequences of her arrogance reflected in every interaction with me. Still, as the days passed, I could feel the tension building. The silence between us had grown heavy, almost unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something broke. I saw it in her eyes, the way they lingered longer each day, the way her lips parted as though words were fighting to escape, the way her shoulders carried a weight she could no longer bear alone. She wanted to speak. She needed to speak. And deep inside, though I remained calm on the surface, I knew that moment was inevitable. Then, one day, it happened. She finally gathered the courage, her eyes brimming with emotions she could no longer contain, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken words. She turned to me, as if ready to strip away the years of silence and reveal everything she had been carrying. Then she finally gathered courage to speak to me. The moment I had once dreamed of was now standing before me. For years, I had imagined what it might feel like if Claire ever looked me in the eye again, not with laughter or disdain, but with recognition of who I had become. I had pictured it in countless ways, sometimes with anger, sometimes with triumph, sometimes with cold indifference. Yet when the moment finally arrived, it was none of those things. It was quieter, heavier, charged with the weight of unspoken years. She stood in front of me, her hands clasped tightly as though she was trying to steady herself, her eyes carrying the storm of regret she had kept buried for far too long. It was late in the evening, after most of the office had emptied. The silence of the building made every sound sharper, the hum of the lights above, the faint clicking of her heels against the floor as she approached, the uneven rhythm of her breath. I was gathering documents, preparing to leave, when I felt her presence behind me. Turning slowly, I met her gaze, and for the first time in years, she didn't look away. Her eyes glistened, vulnerable, almost pleading, and I knew this was it, the confrontation we had both been circling around but had never dared to face until now. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low, uncertain, carrying none of the confidence I once remembered. It was not a request made from authority or pride. It was a question laced with fear, with hesitation, with the desperation of someone who had finally reached the point of no return. I nodded, gesturing for her to sit, though I remained standing. She lowered herself into the chair across from me, her posture stiff, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. For a long moment, silence hung between us, thick and suffocating, until finally she spoke. "I know you remember," she began, her voice trembling. "I know you remember that night, what I said to you, how I laughed. I can't forget it either. It's haunted me for years." Her eyes searched mine, desperate for some sign of forgiveness, some indication that I might soften. But I gave her none. I remained calm, detached, the silence pressing her to continue. "I was young, arrogant, foolish," she went on, her words spilling out like a confession she had rehearsed 1,000 times. "I thought I knew everything. I thought status and money mattered more than anything else. I hurt you that night. I humiliated you. And I regret it more than I can ever explain." Her voice cracked then, a small sob escaping her lips before she quickly tried to steady herself. I studied her carefully. The way her shoulders slumped, the way her eyes glistened with unshed tears, the way her hands twisted nervously in her lap. This was not the girl who had once stood tall, laughing at my confession in front of others. This was a woman broken by the weight of her own choices, seeking forgiveness not just from me, but perhaps from herself. "I've watched you," she admitted softly. "I've watched you build something extraordinary. You've become everything I once thought only men from wealthy families could be. And every day I've worked here, I've seen the respect you command, the life you've built, and I've thought about what could have been if I hadn't been so blind." She paused, her voice dropping even lower, almost to a whisper. "I threw away something real for something shallow, and it's the greatest mistake of my life." Her words hung in the air, heavy, raw, almost painful in their honesty. She had given me everything, her regret, her vulnerability, her confession. It was the moment I had once longed for, the moment I had imagined during sleepless nights, the moment when she would finally see me, not as the poor boy she had mocked, but as the man I had become. And yet, standing there, calm and composed, I realized how differently it felt from what I had once imagined. There was no triumph, no overwhelming sense of victory, only a quiet recognition that the tables had turned and that I now held the power she had once wielded so carelessly. I leaned against the desk, folding my arms, my gaze steady on her trembling form. "You hurt me," I said finally, my voice calm, measured, deliberate. "More than you'll ever know. That night you didn't just reject me. You stripped me of dignity in front of others. You made me believe I was nothing. And I carried that wound for years." Her tears spilled then, silent trails down her cheeks as she nodded, as though agreeing with every word of her own condemnation. "I know," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I need you to hear me say I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry." The silence stretched between us again, heavier now, filled with the sound of her quiet sobs and my steady breathing. I remained calm, unmoved by her display, not out of cruelty, but out of a strength I had cultivated through years of struggle. She had expected, perhaps, anger or bitterness, maybe even vindication. But what she faced instead was composure, restraint, the quiet dignity of a man who no longer needed to shout to be heard. I could see her unraveling beneath that silence. The more I said nothing, the more desperate she became, her words tumbling out in fragments of explanation. She spoke of her upbringing, of the pressure she had felt to choose wealth over sincerity, of the mistakes she had made chasing status that never brought her happiness. She spoke of the emptiness she carried, of the nights when she thought about me, wondering what life might have been like if she had chosen differently. Every word was soaked in regret, every admission a plea for understanding. And yet, even as she spoke, I felt no desire to comfort her. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and I held it not with vengeance but with silence, forcing her to confront every ounce of her guilt without relief. At last, she fell quiet, her shoulders slumping, her eyes red from tears. She looked at me with an expression that was almost unbearable to witness. Part shame, part hope, part desperation. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Say something. Anything. I can't carry this silence anymore." I drew in a deep breath, straightening, my gaze steady on hers. In that moment, I knew the next words I spoke would carry the weight of years, that they would not only define our past, but shape the way she remembered me for the rest of her life. And what I told her next would silence her completely. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply showing you no longer care. For years, I had carried the weight of her laughter, the sting of her rejection, the humiliation of being told that I wasn't enough. I had built my life with that wound as the fire in my chest, and I had always believed that one day I would get the chance to look her in the eye and make her feel the pain she had once inflicted on me. And now, here she was, sitting in front of me, broken, trembling, her voice hoarse from apologies, her eyes heavy with regret. The moment I had dreamed of for so long had finally arrived. But standing there, calm and composed, I realized something shocking. I no longer needed revenge. I didn't need to make her cry. I didn't need to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me, and I didn't need her to feel the same pain I once carried. The boy I had been all those years ago might have longed for that, but the man I had become understood something greater. That true power is not found in vengeance, but in indifference. She was still chained to the past, but I had already walked free of it. I looked at her, her face streaked with tears, her hands shaking as she tried to hold herself together, and I felt nothing. Not the burning anger I once thought I would unleash, not the triumphant satisfaction of seeing her collapse before me, but an emptiness, a quiet clarity. She no longer had the power to hurt me, and because of that, she no longer had the power to matter in the way she once had. "You want me to say something?" I said finally, my voice steady, unshaken, carrying the weight of years of silence. She nodded desperately, her eyes wide, her lips trembling, as though bracing herself for whatever truth I might deliver. "The truth is, Claire, you're right. I will never forget what happened that night. It shaped me, it burned me, it forced me to become someone else. But I don't carry that wound anymore. You don't define me. You never did." Her lips parted, as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. The silence in the room grew thick, pressing down on both of us, until I continued. "You see, the pain you gave me became my greatest teacher. You rejected me because I was poor, because I wasn't the man you thought I needed to be. And you were right about one thing. I wasn't that man, not then. But you also underestimated me, and that was your mistake. You saw me as less, and I turned that into fuel to build a life so far beyond what you could imagine that now you sit here realizing what you lost. And I paused, leaning slightly closer, my voice calm but sharp. "I don't need anything from you, not your apology, not your regret, not your forgiveness, nothing." Her face crumpled then, her eyes filling with fresh tears, her breath catching in her throat. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I need you to know how sorry I am. I need you to believe that I was foolish, that I didn't know better." I shook my head slowly, a faint smile touching my lips. Not cruel, not mocking, but final. You don't need my forgiveness to live with yourself, Claire. That's your battle, not mine. I made peace with my past a long time ago, and I don't wake up thinking about you, or that night, or the pain you caused. I wake up thinking about the life I've built, the person I've become, and the future I'm still chasing. You don't get to be the center of my story anymore. I took that power away from you. Her body seemed to sag under the weight of those words, as though the last thread of hope she had been clinging to had snapped. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as silent sobs overtook her. I stood there, watching, not with cruelty, but with calm detachment, the way you might watch the tide finally give way to the shore. The silence stretched on, heavy and unyielding, until she lowered her hands and looked at me again. Her eyes were red, swollen, her face pale with the weight of realization. "So that's it?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. "After everything? After what we were? There's nothing left?" I nodded, my voice steady, unwavering. "That's it. You had your chance and you made your choice. And I had mine. My life didn't end that night. It began. And now I am exactly where I need to be, with or without you." Her tears fell freely then, her body trembling with the force of her regret. She nodded slowly, as though accepting the finality of my words, and in that moment I saw her collapse. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. The arrogance that had once defined her was gone, replaced entirely by the hollow weight of knowing she had lost something she could never reclaim. And for me, it wasn't sweet revenge that filled my chest, but something far greater. Freedom. I had grown beyond her rejection, beyond the need for her approval, beyond the desire to prove anything to her. My success, my strength, my peace, they were mine, earned through my own blood and sweat, and no one, not even the girl who had once broken me, could take that away. I stood, gathering my things, my movements calm, deliberate. She remained seated, her shoulders slumped, her eyes distant, as though she had finally accepted defeat. I walked to the door, pausing for only a moment before speaking the final words that would end our story once and for all. "Claire, the truth is, I don't hate you. I don't love you either. I don't feel anything at all. And that is the greatest freedom I could ever have. Because my real victory wasn't over you. It was over myself. Life has a way of turning rejection into destiny. When I look back now, years removed from that night when I walked home humiliated and broken, I see not the end of a story, but the beginning of one I never could have written for myself. That single no, that cruel laugh, those cutting words, they were the very bricks upon which I built my empire. At the time, it felt like my world had ended. In truth, it had only just begun. I was once a boy with nothing. I came from a neighborhood where dreams were treated like luxuries, where every penny mattered, where ambition was often silenced before it could take shape. I was the boy who dared to love someone above his station, who believed sincerity could outweigh wealth, who stood trembling with a heart on fire and walked away with ashes in his hands. That rejection shattered me, but it also stripped me of illusions. It forced me to confront who I was, who I wasn't, and who I wanted to become. Without that pain, without that humiliation, I would never have found the steel hidden in my veins. The journey from poverty to power was not smooth, not simple, not glamorous. It was built in shadows, in silence, in nights when no one was watching. It was built with sacrifices that no one clapped for, with failures that nearly crushed me, with determination that sometimes felt like madness. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered the laughter, the disdain, the way I had been told I wasn't good enough. And instead of breaking me, it became the fuel that carried me through storms. Over the years, I came to understand that rejection is not the end. It is redirection. When life closes a door, it does not mean there is no path forward. It means you were looking in the wrong place. That night, when she turned me away, I thought I had lost everything. What I didn't realize was that I had been freed. Freed from chasing validation, freed from seeking worth in someone else's eyes, freed to discover who I truly was when stripped of approval. Rejection, I learned, is often the universe's way of guiding us to where we truly belong. And pain can be power if you allow it to be. Pain sharpens you, strips away the excess, teaches you what comfort never could. The nights I spent sleepless, the days I spent hungry, the moments I felt invisible, all of them carved me into someone who could withstand storms others would collapse under. Pain became my teacher, my motivator, my silent companion. And though I would never wish it on anyone, I know now that without it, I would not have become the man I am today. I also learned that success is not about proving others wrong. It is about proving yourself right. For years, I believed my rise would only feel complete if she saw it, if she regretted it, if she finally realized what she had lost. But when that moment came, when she sat across from me broken and apologetic, I discovered something unexpected. The real victory wasn't in her regret. It was in my indifference. The moment I realized I no longer cared, that her words no longer had power over me, that I had risen so far beyond needing her validation, that was the true triumph. So what is the lesson that remains? It is this: never let someone else's opinion define your worth. People will laugh at you, dismiss you, tell you that you are not enough. They will measure you against their shallow scales of money, status, or appearance. But their judgment is not the truth. It is only a reflection of their own limitations. You cannot control their words, but you can control what you do with them. You can let them break you, or you can let them build you. If you are rejected, let it fuel you. If you are humiliated, let it sharpen you. If you are told you are not enough, let it ignite the fire within you to become more than they ever imagined. Rejection is not the enemy. It is the catalyst. Pain is not your downfall. It is your forge. And the chains others try to place on you can become the very tools with which you build your freedom. I stand here today not as the boy who was laughed at, but as the man who rose from the ashes of that moment. I built a life not to prove her wrong, but to prove myself right, to honor the promise I once made to myself on a sleepless night, that I would never be powerless again. And now, when I look back, I do not see her as the villain of my story. I see her as the spark, the necessary rejection that redirected me toward the destiny I was always meant to claim. So if you are listening to this, if you are carrying the weight of rejection, of pain, of humiliation, know this: it is not the end. It is not your limit. It is not proof that you are unworthy. It is an invitation to rise, to fight, to build, to become. Your destiny is not decided by the voices that tell you no. It is decided by the voice inside you that whispers, even in the darkest nights, "Yes, I can." And as for me, I walk forward with peace. I carry no hatred, no longing, no unfinished business. Because the real lesson, the one that matters most, is that my victory was never about her or anyone else who doubted me. My victory was over myself, over the boy who once believed he was nothing, over the fear that tried to chain me, over the doubts that threatened to silence me. That is the lesson that remains, and it is the lesson I will carry with me for the rest of my life. If this story moved you, imagine how many more are waiting to be told. Don't just stop here. Hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and let me know if you've ever faced rejection that changed your life. And if you want more powerful stories like this one, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chapter.